Now, to use this provider here in this tab start file, we first of all have to import it by referring to our own package and then the providers folder, and there the mealsprovider.dart file. And with that import added, we also have to add another import where we import this Flutter Riverpod package here, and then the Flutter Riverpod.dart file. And with this import added as well, we have to replace stateful widget with consumer stateful widget, which is basically a stateful widget provided by this Riverpod package, which has some added functionalities that allow us to listen to our providers and to changes in those provider values. Now, if we did not have a stateful widget here, but a stateless widget, we would replace this with consumer widget, like this. But since we had a stateful widget here, it's consumer stateful widget, which we'll need to use. But we'll see consumer widget in action later as well. Now, with the widget class extending consumer stateful widget, we also have to change the state class, also to get rid of this error here. And here we now have to extend consumer state instead of just state. In addition, we should also use consumer state as a type here. So now we got rid of all these errors, and we're extending these consumer classes for both the widget class and the state class. Now, by doing so, we behind the scenes add functionality to those classes that allows us to reach out to the providers we might have defined, like this meals provider here. And we can use this functionality here in the tab's screen state class now. There, I want to get my meals, and previously here I imported and used dummy meals. Now we can get those meals from the provider. And for that, we now got a new ref property available here in this state class. Just as we have widget available to reach out to the widget that belongs to this state, we now have a ref property available that allows us to set up listeners to our providers. So this ref property is added by Riverpod, and it is available because we are extending consumer state here in this state class. Now, with this ref property available, the question of course is what we can do with it. And what we can do is we can use a couple of utility methods. Most importantly, read to get data from our provider once, or watch to set up a listener that will make sure that the build method executes again as our data changes. And the official Riverpod documentation recommends to use watch as often as possible, even if you technically only need to read data once, because this way, if you ever change your logic, you can't run into unintended bugs where you forgot to replace a read with a watch. That's why they recommend that you always use watch right from the start. Now, watch needs a parameter though. And the parameter it needs, or the argument it needs, is a provider. So here we now want to use the meals provider that we created and stored in this meals provider Dart file, in this file here. We're defining it here, we're importing this file here in the tab start file, hence we can access this variable here. And we're passing it as a value to watch. Now with that, we set up a listener that will re-execute this build method whenever this meals provider should change. So whenever the data in there should change, which this data here of course never does, but this will change later when we build other providers. Now, nonetheless, with that we got this listener, and in addition, watch also returns the data of the provider it watches. So here we also get our meals, which we can store in a variable. And you can see that it even infers the type correctly because it is able to infer the type of data we are returning here in our provider. So with that, we now get our meals, which we can use here to then filter those meals based on the filters we set. With that, if we save everything and force a restart, you get an error though. And you get an error because creating a provider and extending these consumer classes and then adding a watcher like this is important, but it's not everything. Instead, there's another very important thing you have to do in your Flutter app if you want to use this RiverPod package. You have to go to your main Dart file, and there, where you're calling run app, you have to wrap your app with another widget provided by the RiverPod package. Therefore, here we should also import package flutter riverpod and then flutter riverpod.dart. And with that import added, we should wrap this here with another widget, which can also be set to const. And that widget would be the provider scope widget, which is a widget provided by Flutter Riverpod. Provider scope takes a child parameter, and the value of that parameter is our main entry widget, so the app widget in this case. But wrapping this app with provider scope is important to unlock this behind the scenes state management functionality in the end. And we are wrapping the entire app here so that all the widgets in the entire app can use these RiverPod features. If you knew that only a certain nested part of your app needed those features, it would be enough to wrap that part. But here I want to be able to use RiverPod in the entire app, therefore I will wrap the entire app. And with that now, if you save this and force a reload, the error goes away, and now I can still see my meals here once I select a category, but now technically those meals are not fetched by importing the dummy data file, at least not in a widget, but instead they are fetched through that meals provider. And that's how you generally set up and then also use such a provider by extending these consumer classes in the widgets where you want to use it, and by then using RefWatch. Now that was the basic use case. Basic because we return some dummy data which actually never changes. Well, that's going to change now, because next we're going to build a more dynamic provider.